Alright, so we now move on to finding the rule of a cosine function. And for this, we're going to start right away with an example, and we'll just determine the steps as we move along. But I just want to make sure that everybody understands that I could have also asked you to calculate this rule or to find the rule for this function in terms of a sine function also. So both the cosine and the sine function are the same function, except that there's just a phase shift between them. That's all. And both of them are called the sinusoidal functions. So when you hear the word sinusoidal, you automatically know, okay, sine or cosine. Both of them are equivalent and you can use either or. So in this case, I'm going to show you how to determine the rule based on the cosine part of the function. So for that, the first step, again, the first step like we did for sine was to figure out that halfway line between the maximum and the minimum. So for that, you add your maximum, you add your minimum, and you divide by 2. So 6 plus negative 2, divide that by 2, and you get 2. Your second step is you are going to draw your box using the starting point of your choice. However, this is where there's a little bit of a trick. We know that our starting point for our cosine function is not going to be hk on that halfway line. The starting point is going to be that maximum or minimum. And in this case, I just decided to use the minimum, which is found at negative 2 and negative 2. So this is your starting point. But where is your h and k? Well, from the previous video, we always said, and I stress this very importantly, your h and k is always going to be on that halfway line. So h and k would be at negative 2 and 2. But where's your starting point? Negative 2, negative 2. Alright, so make sure that you have your whole cycle in your box, and then you're able to move on to step number 3, which is to figure out with this function if a is greater than 0 or a is less than 0. So how do you know? Well, remember I told you if you're smiling or if you're sad, if you're frowning, you'll be able to figure this out. So in this case, you are frowning because you are upside down. And if you are frowning, it is because you are less than 0. So you are unhappy. So you're frowning. Step number 4, find your h and k. And as I said, we know what h and k is. It's the point that's on your halfway line, which is technically imaginary. It's not there. The graph does not pass through h and k for a cosine function. So, as we said previously, this value would be negative 2 and 2. Now, really important that you remember this, and I'm going to stress this more and more as we go along. It's the point that's on the red line, which is technically not there. This is very important because this is one of those classic tricks that will show up. Step number 5, find the absolute value of your a and your b parameters. Now, why can't we find the actual values yet? Well, that's because we're going to do that in our last step when we figure out the rule, when we deduce that rule. So the absolute value of a in this case would be 4 because our amplitude is 4. And the absolute value of your b would be 2 pi divided by your period, and your period in this case would be 4. So it would be pi over 2. So once this is done, we're ready to move on to step number 6, which is determining your rule. So writing your rule. Well, using that h and k, I can either have a negative a, or I can have a negative a and a negative b, and both of these would be acceptable. This would not change anything. Some students are going to ask me, sir, do I need to put this in parentheses here? No, you do not. You do not. I just put this here so that we realize that this is the b parameter, and this is your h minus k, which in this case would be a negative 2. Alright, so let's move on to example number 2. Now this case, like I said previously, we can always figure out the same function in terms of sine and cosine. Here's the trick. In this case, I did not show you enough of your graph to determine the rule in terms of a sine function. So you cannot tell me the rule of this function in terms of sine. You're going to have to pretty much figure this out in terms of cosine. And the reason is I always want you to draw that box. And if you do not have enough of a sine function to put in that box, you're not going to get full marks for it. So, if we were to look here, choose a starting point. So your h and your k, we know is going to be on this imaginary line. That's your step 1. So you need to figure out this halfway line. and then that box is there. I chose this as my starting point. I didn't have much of a choice in this case, just because I don't have enough to continue with a box starting at this point. So I need to start at negative pi over 2 and 2. So if this is my starting point, my h and k is going to be this point right here, which is the intersection of the box and the halfway line. In this case, my a is greater than 0, so I am happy because I'm smiling. Your h is negative pi over 2. Your k is negative 1, which is what we said. It is the intersection of your halfway line and your box. We then move on and we say, okay, well, your amplitude is 3, and your absolute value of b is going to be 2 in this case. Once we have all these parameters, I can just put this all together, and because I am positive, my a is positive 3 in this case, or I could also have positive 3, but the b would be negative in this case. And both are acceptable. Aesthetically, I prefer the one that has both positives, just because it's simpler, it's easier, you probably won't make as many mistakes with it.